Hey guys, so last week I made a little Lego Star Wars blaster, and the reaction was a bit more than I expected, and I've had a few people asking me to make a walkthrough of how I set it up. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's this guy. I posted these renders on 10,000 hours, the Renderman forum, that sort of stuff. But yeah, so this isn't really going to be a tutorial as such. It's more just a walkthrough, mostly just rambling about the scene, to be honest. Haven't really got a structure for what I'm about to do. But yeah, so these are the renders I'll walk through. So first off, I'm using Maya 2019 and Renderman 23. So not everything I'm doing will apply directly to every other renderer, but the techniques are pretty standard. I did this project more to learn Renderman because I'm pretty new to look dev in Renderman. I've more been a V-Ray guy in history. But yeah, so just to walk through the scene. So in the scene, I don't know if you can read this. It's 1440p, so the text is scaled really small. But I've got a ground plane, which, just doing normal ground plane stuff. Got some ground debris here. Nothing special going on here, just some cubes that were smoothed and then randomly transformed, and the NURBS curve, which has a Martian hair shader attached to it, so nothing special there. A little look dev kit, chrome ball, grey ball, and a Macbeth chart. These are just like generic kind of look dev information tools, really. Tell you what the lighting is doing, tell you what the color's like. And for lighting, I've got a Pixar dome light. There's no overlights in the scene. This HDR is one that I made 3 or 4 years ago now. It's not perfect. It was my bathroom. I was doing this for some catch-up renders that I did back then. But yeah, so there's nothing really particularly special about the scene setup itself. Just the look dev kit seems to throw a few people off. But yeah, so into the gun. Modeling is really simple. Really, I should have modeled these as one piece, but since it was just to kind of practice look dev, never really spent the time to do so. UVs are pretty standard, so UV editor. They're not overly clean. There's a little bit of no overlap, but I mean, if you're doing this for production, you definitely straighten out these. You straighten this out. You probably want to straighten the borders of this for better tiling and make more use of the space, because this is pretty inefficient. The handle is just a handle. It's scaled really small just so that the UV scales match. They're obviously overlapping, but I'm not using textures, so it's fine. But yeah, so this is scaled down so that if I use one noise on both of these pieces, that noise will be the same size on both. Yeah, so nothing really going on with those. There is some little dust kind of modeled in, but again, it's just little cubes scattered around. There's nothing really difficult, just kind of scattered in the places you'd expect to build up. The only thing in the model that is quite strange for especially beginners. So we've got this cap, which I wanted to be a clear plastic. I did take some creative liberty with the material. In reality, these blasters tend to have a very thin cap, so it's not like a volume, it's more just like a little shell. I didn't really like the way it looked, so I wanted to do something that just felt a bit more voluminous, a bit more physical. So I made it solid, but because I was doing a clear plastic, I wanted to make sure it had some extra detail in that. So something I did was, if I go into 4, I scattered some spheres inside it and inverted the normals before combining the object, and all that does, it just adds little pockets of missing density from the object. You can do that in shader, but the setup would be quite complex. I couldn't really be bothered with that, and to be fair, I think doing it in Geo is a lot more efficient as well. So just to quickly clarify for any beginners, the reason the normals are inverted on these is because if we think about how this actually is in reality, these are air balls, right? So if we didn't invert the normals, what would happen is we have our cap. Come on, let me draw. It's not gonna let me draw. Why is it so loud? There we go. Get there eventually. Right, so we've got our cap. Light goes in, light goes through, light comes out. If we didn't invert the normals, let's say we got a bubble here, what we're really saying is we've got this plastic which fills up this entire area, and then we've got another little ball of plastic inside it. So the light would get like really kind of distorted by that, and it would be extra density, which is the exact opposite of what we want. If we invert the normals, what we're saying is that the plastic isn't here, so we're just filling this volume. That just means it shades more correctly, the light bounces through it properly. It's less likely to reflect out, it's more likely just to go through, travel through the air pocket rather than bounce off it. But yeah, so it's not really difficult to do at all, to be honest. It's literally just a case of create a sphere, invert the normals on it, scatter it around, and just merge the object. Merging the object just to make it simpler to just put the shader and everything. UVs, again, nothing special. This is all the air bubbles. I don't really need any texture detail on them, so they're just kind of put here, all overlapping. But again, if you were shading this for production, you definitely want to straighten out these rings, except for the front ones. So like this ring, which is this guy, oh, he is straight. But you would want to make sure that all of them are straightened out perfectly, rather than this bending thing that you got going on, because that will just make the tiling of the textures a little bit less accurate. But yeah, so that's it for the model. There really isn't anything too special going on. I mean, to be fair, the whole scene, there's nothing complex individually. It might seem it if you're new to shading, but there is really no difficult steps. It's just kind of a case of learning what stuff means. But yeah, so let's get into the shader. So I've got two shaders in the scene. We've got, well, just for the blaster, we've got the red plastic at the front, which is this here, and we've got our black plastic, which has a few more nodes but isn't really any more complex. So when building a shader, I normally like to start with a displacement. So I'm just going to start an IPR. Give this a second to kick in. Cool, put that there. So this is our gun. So starting off with displacement, I'm not really going to talk about how you connect stuff. I'm just going to talk about kind of what is being layered. Let me just get this off to the side. So all that there. Cool. So starting off, we've got a large plastic, a large bump. So this isn't surface detail. This is more just fixing lazy modeling. Whenever you're modeling something that you intend on being even remotely organic or not perfectly milled out of diamond, you're always going to have some bending on the surface. So all this displacement is doing is just making the silhouette less perfect. So if we zoom in here, in this area where it's whiter, you can see how it's actually bumping out a bit. If I turn off the displacement, so I'm just going to turn off this guy, gain 1. You see how this is like a perfectly straight edge? Let's turn off this, hide you. So it's very boring looking. Like you can tell, it's very obviously a Maya model. The edges are perfect. You don't get in them in real life. So I'm going to turn the displacement back on, and we'll just go through the layer texture and see what's going on there. But yeah, so that just breaks it up. So we got a layer texture, and that is just all the layers being added together. They're either add or subtract. I don't like using over blend modes. But yeah, so let's just turn that off. So we've got, this is our base model. We add the large displacement that I just shown you, and that just goes in, as I said, breaks up the silhouette. It doesn't really break the silhouette, it more just bends it around a bit, makes it feel less perfect. We then have a rougher displacement. I'll talk about what these offsets are in a second. We then have a rougher displacement, which is pretty much the same map, just a little bit higher frequency. So if I display that, and that again, it's not really doing any particular detail, it's more just adding some warble to the object, making it feel less solid, a bit more like soft plastic, because again, in real life these tend to be a lot more aggressively bumped than what I've done. But I wanted a really soft looking plastic, almost rubbery in some ways. And yeah, adding that in, if we let this clean up for a second, that second displacement is the one that's doing, like you see these bumps here, so you got like 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what that's doing. It does make a decent difference. You always want to start really with the biggest displacements. It's the same with ZBrush sculpting, where you see it a lot. I know that I did it when I started out, is you block out a head and then you start doing skin pores and you wonder why it doesn't look real. Well, it doesn't look real because you didn't add any secondary breakup. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just adding secondary breakup with 2 fractals, one bigger than the other. Obviously the strength is appropriate for that. I then add a hair displacement. This map, don't know how to spell it. I don't know how to pronounce it either, but it's a pack online called dGruwer, Gruwer, Surface Imperfections. It's an amazing library of textures, so I use quite a lot of those. This is just using a Pixar texture node and a Pixar manifold, because you can't use tiling in file nodes. But yeah, so if I turn on that layer, all that one's doing is going in and it turns on. It's more of like, this is where we start getting the fine details. I'm using this, although it's a hair map, I'm using it more for scratches. The scale I've got it set to. You see how it's like, I'm just doing that here. I've not remapped the texture or anything like that. I've actually just used the texture as it is. I can show that, see how it looks. So that's what the texture looks like. It has actually quite a lot of nice extra information that I didn't intend on using, but it's always nice to have. But these scratches are what I really wanted from it. And then the final layer is this Fractal Lines. Now, this Fractal Lines isn't really a perfect thing. The alpha is set incredibly low. If I turn that on, it's again more of like a mid-frequency warble, but it's got some lines in it too. I think it's just a woolly. No, it's just a turbulent noise. So this one, it's pretty subtle, but it's basically a noise that has lines in it. So if I show you what the map looks like, this is what the map is doing. Now it's adding some low frequency bump, which I didn't really want from it that much, to be honest. But something I quite like from it is, if I let this clean up for a second, it's going to add like little crevices. Very soft, very, very soft because of the strength I've got it set to. But you can see it here, there's almost like a little sharp highlight here. It's very subtle, but for me it feels like it adds quite a lot, especially at this kind of distance. I don't know how well this will read when the video is uploaded. But it does have like a kind of snaky feel to it. This isn't necessarily realistic, but I do quite like the way it feels. So that's it for the displacement layering. And the final displacement map looks like this. It's pretty low strength, and it's also been offset. So that's what these offsets are. If you're new to displacement, you might not be aware of offsetting. This is something that's kind of done for you if you export 32-bit maps from ZBrush and set the mid to 0. Basically, what these offsets do is the map goes from 0 to 1, right? So if we're displacing an object, 0 is no displacement, the object doesn't move. 1 is it moves outwards. Anything between that, it moves outwards less or more. Now, the problem is if you add lots and lots of displacements, your object slowly gets bigger. So basically what I've done is I create a layer texture which is set to half the strength of my displacement. So we've got our displacement going in, our displacement is set to a strength of 0.06 because that's what worked well. I'm then adding a layer which is set to subtract, and the alpha is set to 0.03. Now it's not perfect, the map won't be exactly center, but if I turn this off, you'll notice that it grows a little bit. So you see how the gun inflates? Now that might work well for what you want, but really if you was to give this to someone in animation, they match all their lines up perfectly. They get the character holding the handle and then the displacement inflates everything. Well, it's not going to be matching anymore. Doesn't look particularly good. So I always like to add an offset to my large displacements. I didn't do it for the Fractal Lines and the hair map just because they don't really inflate it that much. But this is an important step for me. I mean, I guess for a lot of people it's an important step, but there's probably a way to automate this. If you're able to get the average value of a map, just subtract that average. If it's a positive number, if it's a negative number, just add that difference. and then that would like perfectly offset it, assuming that the map is averaged pretty well. But yeah, so going off on a bit of a tangent. But yeah, so offsetting is really important. That's kind of the end of that. So that's displacement. The surface shader is actually really simple for this guy. So let's go over the specular roughness first. We've got just a map, another Grower map. I think that's how you spell it, pronounce it. Sorry if it's not. But yeah, so just using that, and then I'm remapping that with a Pixar remap. If you're not using Renderman, you can just use a value remap. It's tab remap value, I think it's called. Yeah, remap value. Or you could use a HSV, or you can even use a ramp. It's up to you. But all I'm doing is I'm taking the map, which goes from 0 to 1. It spends a lot of that time at 1 or close to, like 0.9 or something. In fact, yeah, 0.95 is the value on my cursor at the moment. And I'm just reducing that so that the roughness is more in line with what I want. So it's actually 0.47, which gives me quite a nice soft look. Again, not perfect. If it was really a hard plastic, normally you'd expect a bit of a sharper reflection, so less roughness. And if I was adding more high frequency detail in my displacement, so if I was doing like a little cells noise for really hard plastic, that would require me to reduce the roughness of the reflection, just because the displacement itself will be roughening the reflection, which is always something that's a bit tricky to balance. And then after that, we get into diffuse. So diffuse has a bit more going on. Not much, though, to be honest. So let's just move over here. So the displacement, the first thing we've got is we want to get the color of our actual plastic correct. So I just started with a Voronoi, set to a very low color scale, because I didn't really want much color. It's just, if this was a flat black, it would look very boring. So it's just kind of rough noise. You can see the pattern here. Quite like the way that it looks, to be honest. It's a really nice noise. I do quite like the noises in Pixar's Renderman. But yeah, so that's the kind of the base diffuse of the plastic. And then we're using a Pixar blend to add a dust on top. So the way I've got it set up at the moment is I've got a color, which let's just get that color saved. So I can set the color of the dust to whatever I want. I can make it blue if I want to. Obviously you wouldn't do that, but the option's there if you want to. So that's how that would look. Pretty gross, to be honest. So let's just set that back to what it was, or close to what it was. And then the way that we're getting that mask, the top alpha that it's using, is we have a Pixar dirt. And the Pixar dirt is just an ambient occlusion node. I could use curvature as well, but I just found that ambient occlusion, I preferred the results. So all that's doing is it's just giving me a mask in the areas that are occluded, where you get dust buildup normally. This isn't perfectly accurate. Strictly speaking, there would be more dust on top than the bottom, or on the side if the gun's been laid on its side for a while. So you could use a snow node. That's the node that Maya has. I don't know if that works with Renderman. I've never tested it. But this would give you like a mask that's only on top. In fact, let's just test it, see how it goes. Yeah, it doesn't work. But if you're using other renderers, hopefully they support it. So let's just put that in. Put that there. But yeah, and then we've got this Pixar Voronoi dust break up here. So that's not really doing a huge amount, and to be honest, it's kind of in the wrong place. All I wanted for this was just to break up the color, because without this, it would be a perfect dust covering, which I didn't really like. I ended up stylizing it a bit and going for quite a rough noise, which again isn't what you'd necessarily get. But all this noise is doing, it's just that, basically. It's just a little mosaic to vary the value of the dust. The correct way to use something like this would be in the radius of the Pixar dirt, so that the actual line around the edge is more broken up. I didn't do that. It's technically not correct, but it worked. I quite liked the way it looked. Bit artificial, but it's just appealing to me. But strictly speaking, you would expect to kind of have a bit more variation in like the radius of that ambient occlusion. But yeah, that's it really for that material. It's quite a simple material. Nothing there should be particularly new to many people. If you're quite new to look dev, definitely spend time looking into displacement. That should, at least in my opinion, be the priority in learning, just because that carries the shader really far. You know, if I turn off the displacement, it really does a lot for this shader, because the shader itself is so basic. I literally only spent a couple hours making this asset, so it would take a lot longer if I wanted to do the maps properly. But having that displacement really does help. So the red plastic, this one's a lot more complex. Simpler setup technically, just a lot more going on. So this is my plastic. I'm just going to quickly go to the other side to kind of show what the shader's doing on the back. So we're getting this kind of like quite nice scattering going through. It's like really bright and highlights. So when you're approaching this sort of shader, there's a few things that I had to balance. Again, I didn't necessarily do it the correct way, but then there's not really a correct way for everything, I guess. Although if there's any look dev artists that watch this or anyone that's more knowledgeable, please do let me know if there is like a set method in the industry, because I've been working at NPC for a couple of years, primarily as a groom artist. Been doing look dev for years before that, but only really as a student or just a hobbyist almost. So if there is a correct method for this stuff, do let me know, because I like to learn as well. But yeah, so tangent off. But yeah, so it gives me this quite nice highlight stuff. So let's talk about the actual setup of this. So again, first off, let's just start with displacement. Displacement is super simple in this guy. It's just a low frequency bump. I didn't do really anything, to be honest, to the actual object shape. I just wanted it to not be perfectly straight. So if I turn this off, let's see what it does. So it's exactly as you expect. This edge is perfectly round because it was modeled as a perfect cylinder. Adding this displacement just kinks it a little bit. It's a little bit flatter on top. I didn't intentionally put it on top, it's just kind of how it worked out. But at the end of the day, it's just there to kind of break up shapes. So the actual shader itself, let's just quickly go over the maps and I'll talk about the different layers that I'm using. So we have a smudges map, again, Brewer. This guy's great. Very generic scratch map, to be honest. Let's just quickly go through. Oh, did I add a space? There we go. Very generic scratch map. Nothing particularly, nothing different about how I set it up. There's no tiling, so I didn't need a manifold. So we can just go around this guy. So for bump, we used it in bump. We just plugged it in exactly as it is, scaled it down. That's going through and just kind of doing a very fine displacement. I didn't want to put it in actual displacement for this one. No particular reason. I just plugged it into bump in this case. I guess it is good though to use bump for this high frequency stuff. It's always going to be a bit higher res unless I subdivide my object like 10 times. So I'm also inverting this texture. That is so that I can do diffuse gain and specular roughness. So the reason that these two are connected to the same map. Well, let's go over why I'm inverting it first. So this is a refractive object for the most part. So diffuse and refraction don't really combine well. I don't know the physics reason behind it. It's just I normally find that if I'm doing refraction on something, diffuse just looks wrong. I guess it's because refraction is light going through a surface. Diffuse is like kind of getting stuck in a surface to an extent, or getting completely torn apart by a rough surface. I'm not really too aware of the physics behind it, but they're generally incompatible in terms of how I like to use them. So I've got this invert just to make it so that I've got more diffuse in some areas, and the roughness is driven with the same map. So the reflections get more rough in the areas where there's more diffuse, and that just makes it feel a little bit more natural. So that's the way I've got it in my diffuse weight. It's incredibly sharp, just because I wanted just a tiny touch of diffuse. I know I just said how it's not really compatible, but it does help if you use it a tiny amount. Then my Speck Roughness is a pretty subtle remap, to be honest. In fact, I'm not entirely sure it is remapping. Oh, there it is. So output min, just changing it to have the look I wanted. Most of the map is on the lower end, the 0.26. So that means that most of the reflections are pretty smooth, and then in the areas where there's more diffuse, it's a lot rougher, which kind of cancels out a bit of that refraction. So that's it for the map. So let's talk through the actual shader itself and kind of see what's going on there. Let's go to this side. So, plastic shader. Starting off, I'm going to turn off my, let's turn off that. Remember, it's halfway. Glass, refraction gain. Okay, and then I need to go to single scatter and turn that off as well. So, just looking at diffuse for a second and reflection, this is what the actual object looks like. This is with no refraction, no subsurface, so this is just a solid object. The bubbles we added will have no impact because no light is getting through this thing. So yeah, in the areas where the reflections are rougher, we've got more diffuse, that kind of gives this look. I did do this after I did the refraction, so do keep that in mind. But yeah, so just adding that kind of gives it a little bit of a nice look. Go down to refraction. So I started with refraction. I didn't think I'd need single scatter for a while, and this is what refraction does. So the refraction is not very rough, 0.2 roughness. Refraction color is bright orange, probably brighter than it needs to be. You shouldn't really have full saturation, full value on anything, to be honest, because that implies it's perfect, which nothing is. So strictly speaking, these should at least be like 0.9. But I like the way it looks, and I'm not going for photorealism, it's more just an interesting looking shader. But one thing you're probably noticing is that this looks really dark. Like if we go to the back, it's still got that really nice bright highlight, but the contrast is kind of disgusting, to be honest. So we've got this like amazingly bright kind of highlight right here, and then right next to it is a value of 0.0005. Those shouldn't be that close together. So what I wanted to do was kind of flatten this a little bit. And by flatten it, what I mean is we've got this object that is made of plastic. And this amount of contrast is suggesting that the object is completely perfect. So light goes in on one side, bounces once, comes out on the other side, and has only bounced twice in the whole time, other than the bubbles, which you can kind of see here. So you know, the fact it's got so much contrast suggests the light is going cleanly through, which it is, because that's all I've got on it, it's just refraction. You can also see the bump doing its job here and the diffuse kind of kicking in, getting rid of some refraction in the process. But single scatter. Let's turn off the refraction for a moment and just turn on single scatter. So the single scatter is basically saying, okay, light is going in and it's bouncing around inside this object. There's actually particles inside the object. It makes it feel more like a volume. So adding this, because it's more kind of homogeneous, it's a lot flatter feeling, but it's brighter than black. It means that when we add our refraction, so I'm just going to do this. So this is what our refraction looks like on its own. We add a little bit of subsurface, and it's really not that strong. It just brightens everything up. It makes it feel a bit flatter in terms of the actual image values. It's still got a fair bit of contrast, probably more than it should, really. But it just makes it feel more like a volume. If I go to the back, it is especially like visible at the back. It feels like light is going in and kind of glowing. It feels a lot more appealing to me. And again, it's just incredibly dark. It's part of that could be the refraction roughness is just being way too low. But again, I quite liked these bright highlights. I wanted to keep those. So I didn't want to change the refraction roughness, but adding that back in just brightens it all up, makes it feel a lot nicer. It also brightens it up more in the areas where light can travel more freely. So at the front, where there's nothing blocking any light, it glows more. Whereas here, where the gun, what the hell? Here, where the gun and the cap overlap, you're getting less light coming through. So let's just let that. Yeah, so you see how it's a lot darker in this area. You can actually see the gun inside it through the roughness. But yeah, so that's kind of it for the setup. Again, like there wasn't really anything particularly special with the setup. It's just a few people asked to see a general breakdown. So here it is. This is a little walkthrough. again, as you can probably tell, really no structure to this. If you do want me to go through and make a more structured tutorial, I can do that, but there are some guys making incredible look dev tutorials out there. Again, I'm more of a hobbyist with look dev. I would like to work in look dev one day maybe, but at the moment it's the only professional experience I've got in it is working with Texturing XYZ a little bit, making some tutorial videos for them like 3-4 years ago now. So do look for tutorials from Arvid Schneider. He's probably one of the main ones. I learned a lot from Grant Warwick and his stuff that he put out. My friend Jesus Fernandez has some decent look dev tutorials. He's more of a groom focus on his Patreon, but he does have some look dev content. And I'm sure there's tons of others out there as well. But yeah, so I hope someone found this interesting and helpful. That'd be quite nice. I'm just going to start a render with this. Where are you? There you are. So yeah, that's our final result. Actually, I should unhide the other objects. There we go. IPR. Yeah, there we go. So that's the final result. I guess one last thing to cover is the camera effects. It's just using the Pixar camera projection, which allows you to do like lens effects. I was doing a little bit of chromatic aberration in the final shape, the final renders that I did. But the main thing is I've got a very strong depth of field, like probably too strong, but this is a miniature, which is why I've got the hair that kind of helped. Camera effects do quite a lot, so, and lighting is obviously incredibly important. The HDR I'm using at the moment, again, I made as a student years ago, but I found it serves me quite well. It's quite evenly lit, it's got fairly decent shadows. Obviously this is quite diffused, but it's got decent shadows, quite a nice defined direction. So don't kind of set up a scene with one area light and expect it to look photoreal. It probably won't. So you can look on HDR Haven. They have quite a lot of really nice HDRs. So just make sure you're looking after your lighting. But yeah, that's kind of the ramble over. If there are any more questions or anything like that, don't hesitate to message me if you want to. You can go on my website if you want to find some tutorials on look dev and groom from quite a while ago now. Haven't really updated it in a while. And my website is www.mikecouchyart.com. You can find showreel and all that stuff on there. But yeah, I hope this has been informative for some people. Maybe one day I'll do a less rambly video with a bit more structure. I swear I do know what I'm doing to some extent. But yeah, it's been fun, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your night, guys. Bye.